For 2,000 years, history has had one version of Carthage. Rome wrote it, Rome enforced it, and Rome made certain no alternative survived. Every library was burned. Every Carthaginian record was destroyed. Every temple was leveled into dust. What remained was exactly what Rome intended: a portrait of savages, child killers, enemies of civilization, a people the world was better without. And for 20 centuries, nobody could prove otherwise. Until now. Ancient DNA extracted from Carthaginian burial sites is telling a completely different story. Scientists feeding genomic data through artificial intelligence analysis are cross-examining a 2,000-year-old smear campaign, and the results contradict the Roman account on almost every point. The people history condemned were something far more complex, far more cosmopolitan, and far more genetically surprising than anyone predicted. What the DNA revealed about the Carthaginians doesn't just revise ancient history, it rewrites it entirely. Before Rome erased them, Carthage was the most powerful civilization the Western Mediterranean had ever produced. Not a barbaric outpost clinging to the North African coast. Not a trading post that got lucky. A genuine superpower, with twin harbours engineered to a standard that Roman architects would later study and struggle to replicate. 6-story apartment buildings that towered over streets humming with merchants from 3 continents. And a population that some estimates place above 500,000 at its peak. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage controlled the commercial arteries of the entire Western Mediterranean. Its navy was the most feared on earth. The story begins, as so many Mediterranean stories do, on the Levantine coast. The Phoenicians, a seafaring people from the coastal cities of what is now Lebanon, northern Israel, and western Syria, had spent centuries mastering ocean trade, while their neighbors were still thinking in terms of land. They linked markets that had never been linked before, moved goods that had never moved that far, and seeded colonies across every shoreline the Mediterranean offered. By 814 BCE, one of those colonies had been planted on a peninsula jutting into the sea in what is now Tunisia. They named it Carthage, the new city. We know it as Carthage. The founding myth centers on Dido, a Tyrian princess who fled her brother's murderous coup, sailed west with a group of loyal followers, and through a famous act of cleverness claimed enough land to build a city. Told she could have whatever an ox hide could cover, she cut the hide into the thinnest possible strips, laid them end to end, and enclosed enough ground to found a civilization. Whether the story is true matters less than what it reveals, that even in their own mythology, the Carthaginians defined themselves through ingenuity rather than force. For centuries, Carthage grew. It shook off its subordinate relationship with its Phoenician mother cities. It absorbed neighboring settlements. It built. It traded, it expanded. By 500 BCE, it had developed a republican system of government sophisticated enough that Aristotle himself analysed it admiringly, comparing its structure favorably to both Sparta and Rome. And then Rome destroyed it. Not gradually, not partially, completely. In 146 BCE, after the Third Punic War, Roman forces spent 17 days burning Carthage to the ground. Every building demolished. Every text incinerated. Every cultural record wiped from existence. The Carthaginians had kept extensive libraries, detailed histories, agricultural manuals, religious texts, an entire literary civilization. None of it survived. What did survive was the Roman version of who they were. And that version, it turns out, was never the truth. When you control the historical record, you control the verdict. And Rome controlled everything. The accusation that defined Carthage in the ancient imagination and that has followed them through every history book written since was child sacrifice. Roman and Greek writers described a ritual they called the Tophet, a sacred precinct in Carthage where, according to these accounts, infants and young children were burned alive as offerings to the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. The descriptions were vivid, specific, and horrifying. Diodorus Siculus wrote of bronze statues with outstretched arms over open flames. Plutarch described the faces of grieving parents who were forbidden from showing emotion during the ritual. The Roman orator Tertullian claimed the practice continued in secret, even into his own era. For centuries, nobody questioned it. Why would they? The accounts were consistent, the sources were multiple, and archaeology seemed to confirm the story. When excavations at the Tophet site in Carthage in the 20th century uncovered thousands of urns containing the cremated remains of young children, the academic world largely nodded. Here was the physical evidence. Here were the victims. But the story had already begun to unravel before a single strand of ancient DNA was ever extracted. Archaeologists and physical anthropologists who examined the Tophet remains more carefully started noticing things that didn't fit the sacrifice narrative. Many of the children showed no skeletal evidence of trauma consistent with violent death. The age distribution of the remains, heavily weighted toward newborns and very young infants, matched the natural mortality patterns of ancient populations, where infant death was tragically common, far more closely than it matched the profile of a ritual selection process. A landmark 2010 study in the journal Antiquity argued directly that the Tophet was a specialized infant cemetery, not a sacrificial precinct. The scholarly debate intensified. Other researchers pushed back. The argument split along deep lines, with some historians maintaining that where there is this much smoke across this many independent ancient sources, some fire must exist. What nobody could resolve was the fundamental problem at the heart of the entire debate. Every written source describing Carthaginian child sacrifice was written by a Greek or a Roman. Not one Carthaginian account survived. Not one Punic text offered their own explanation of what the Tophet was or what it meant. Rome had ensured that silence completely and permanently. This is why the arrival of ancient DNA analysis was so significant. For the first time, it was possible to ask questions of the Carthaginian dead directly, questions that required no Roman interpreter, no Greek chronicler, no enemy's translation. And the dead, it turned out, had a great deal to say. The breakthrough came in 2023, and it was unlike anything previously attempted in the study of the ancient Mediterranean world. An international research team led by scientists at the University of Vienna, working in collaboration with institutions across Europe and North America, conducted the first large-scale ancient genomic analysis of Carthaginian remains ever undertaken. The scale of the project was extraordinary. Samples were drawn not just from Carthage itself, but from burial sites spread across the full geographic footprint of the Carthaginian Empire, Sardinia, Sicily, and the Iberian Peninsula. For the first time, researchers were not examining a single cemetery in isolation. They were reading the genetic signature of an entire civilization across the full span of its territorial reach. Extracting ancient DNA is not a straightforward process. The genetic material inside human remains degrades rapidly after death, attacked by bacteria, moisture, and time. After 2,000 years in North African and Mediterranean soil, what survives is typically fragmented, broken into tiny pieces that bear only a partial resemblance to an intact genomic sequence. The work happens in sterile cleanroom laboratories where researchers wear full protective suits to prevent any contamination from modern human DNA, which would corrupt the ancient signal entirely. Bone and tooth samples are ground into powder, chemically treated to release whatever genetic fragments remain, and then sequenced using technology that can read millions of degraded fragments simultaneously and computationally, reconstruct a coherent genomic picture. The teeth proved particularly valuable. Dental pulp is encased in enamel, one of the hardest biological substances on Earth, which provides extraordinary protection against the degradation that destroys DNA in other tissues. From Carthaginian molars that had sat in the soil for over 2 millennia, the team recovered genomic data of remarkable quality and resolution. What they were looking for was ancestry, the deep genetic signatures that reveal where a population ultimately came from, who they mixed with, and how their genetic composition shifted across time and geography. They compared the Carthaginian profiles against a vast reference database of ancient and modern populations spanning the entire Mediterranean world and beyond, from the Levant to the Atlantic coast. The results cleared the contamination thresholds. The sequences were authentic. The data was solid. And then the team looked at what the genomes were actually saying about who these people were, and the picture that emerged contradicted almost every assumption that had been built into the question. The Carthaginians were not who Rome said they were. They were not even who the researchers expected them to be. Their genetic identity was something the ancient world had never been given credit for producing. Something extraordinary. Here is where everything changes. The genomic data assembled from Carthaginian burial sites revealed a population of stunning genetic diversity, one that bore only partial resemblance to the Levantine Phoenician ancestry that everyone had assumed would dominate the picture. Yes, Middle Eastern genetic signatures were present. The Phoenician founding population had left its mark. But it was not the overwhelming signal researchers expected from a colonial population that Roman sources portrayed as a foreign, alien presence imposing itself on the Mediterranean world. What the DNA showed instead was a civilization that had absorbed people from virtually everywhere it touched. Significant ancestry from the Western Mediterranean appeared consistently across the sampled individuals, genetic signatures pointing to Sardinia, the Iberian Peninsula, and the broader European coastal world. North African ancestry was present in proportions that reflected genuine integration with local Libyan and Berber populations, not the superficial contact of a colony that kept itself deliberately separate. Some individuals carried genetic profiles that traced back across the full length of the Mediterranean trading world. The picture was not of an ethnically coherent transplant from the Levant, maintaining its genetic purity in foreign soil. It was of a melting pot, genuinely, measurably, genomically cosmopolitan. Consider what this means in practice. A person buried in a Carthaginian cemetery in Sardinia might carry ancestry from the Levant, from Iberia, and from local Sardinian farming populations simultaneously. Another individual buried in Carthage itself showed genetic signatures that placed their recent ancestry not in Phoenicia, but in the Western Mediterranean entirely. The Carthaginian population was not a single thing. It was a convergence point for the ancient world's movement of peoples. This finding carries a particular resonance when set against the Basques, that other population whose genetics science has recently illuminated. Where the Basques represent extraordinary genetic continuity, an ancient population that absorbed almost nobody and changed almost not at all across millennia, Carthage represents the precise opposite. Maximum openness, maximum integration, a civilization whose genetic fingerprint was as diverse as its trading empire was vast. And this is precisely what makes the Roman characterization so revealing in its dishonesty. Rome portrayed Carthage as the dangerous foreign other, a Semitic, Eastern, alien civilization threatening the natural order of the Mediterranean world. But the DNA shows that the Carthaginians were, in the most literal biological sense, the Mediterranean world. They were not outsiders imposing themselves on it. They were its product, its synthesis, its fullest human expression. Rome did not destroy a foreign enemy. Rome destroyed a mirror and then spent 2,000 years making certain nobody noticed. The child sacrifice question had divided historians for decades. The DNA didn't end the argument. It did something more powerful. It changed the terms of it entirely. When the research team turned their genomic analysis toward the remains recovered from the Tophet burial grounds, what they found was not the genetic signature of ritual selection. It was the genetic signature of a cemetery. The distinction matters enormously, and here is why. If the Tophet had functioned as a sacrificial precinct where specific children were chosen for ritual killing, you would expect the population buried there to reflect that selection process in some measurable way, such as particular age clusters, unusual patterns in the ratio of males to females, or genetic evidence of children drawn from specific family lineages designated for sacrifice. What the DNA revealed instead was a population distribution consistent with natural infant mortality. The genetic diversity among the Tophet remains was broad. The age distribution was heavily weighted toward newborns and very young infants, precisely the demographic that ancient populations lost in the greatest numbers to disease, complications at birth, and the brutal mortality rates that characterized the earliest weeks of life before the modern era. These were not children selected for death. The genomic evidence suggested strongly that these were children who had already died and whose families had brought them to a sacred place for burial, in the same way that bereaved parents across the ancient world sought consecrated ground for the children they had lost. This aligned with what the most rigorous physical anthropological studies had been arguing since at least 2012, but it added something those studies could not provide. Genetic evidence is independent of interpretation in a way that skeletal analysis is not. Bone trauma can be debated. DNA population patterns are harder to argue away. What the evidence collectively suggests is that Rome took a Carthaginian practice of infant burial, likely a genuinely sacred and grief-filled ritual honoring children who died young, and reframed it as something monstrous. The transformation required almost no effort. The burials were real. The cremated remains were real. All Rome needed to do was supply the interpretation, and with no Carthaginian voices left to object, that interpretation calcified into historical fact. The persistence of the child sacrifice narrative across 2,000 years of scholarship tells us something important, not about Carthage, but about the power of propaganda, when the propagandist also controls the archive. Rome needed Carthage to be evil. The scale of the destruction Rome visited upon a civilian population, an entire culture, an entire literary tradition required moral justification. Manufacturing monsters is always easier than admitting what you actually did. Stand back from the individual findings for a moment and consider what they add up to. The most commercially dominant civilization in the Western Mediterranean for 3 centuries was also its most genetically diverse. A population that Roman propaganda reduced to a single threatening identity, Eastern, foreign, barbaric, turns out to have been a living synthesis of virtually every culture its trade networks touched. Levantine founders, European settlers, North African neighbors, Iberian traders who stayed, Sardinian populations absorbed across generations, all of them present in the genomic record, all of them Carthaginian. And this genetic openness was not incidental to Carthaginian civilization. It was the engine of it. The agricultural manuals that Carthaginian scholars produced were so advanced that Rome, after burning every other Punic text, made a specific exception for these. They were translated into Latin and distributed across the empire. The Carthaginian system of republican government was sophisticated enough to earn the genuine analytical admiration of Aristotle. Their trade networks reached places the Roman imagination had barely mapped: West Africa, the British Isles, the edges of the Persian world. This was not the achievement of an insular, ethnically rigid people. It was the achievement of a civilization that understood, at the deepest level, that openness produces strength. The DNA confirms what the history, stripped of its Roman filter, had always suggested. Carthage was not the enemy of Mediterranean civilization, it was one of its highest expressions, which forces an uncomfortable question. If the Roman account of Carthage was this distorted, constructed this deliberately, maintained this effectively across this many centuries, how many other ancient civilizations are we fundamentally misunderstanding for exactly the same reason? How many peoples did Rome, Greece, or other dominant powers defeat, erase, and then define? The Gauls, the Numidians, the Etruscans. Every one of them understood today almost exclusively through the words of the people who conquered them. Carthage is the starkest case, the most complete erasure, the most thoroughly documented smear, but it is not an exception. It is a pattern, and ancient DNA is only beginning to expose how wide that pattern runs. What the genomic revolution is doing, one degraded tooth and one cold laboratory at a time, is returning a voice to to the voiceless. The Carthaginian dead cannot write new histories, but their DNA carries information that no conqueror thought to burn, no propagandist thought to suppress, and no archive could contain. 2,000 years of silence. And now, finally, the dead are speaking. What they are saying changes everything we thought we knew, and raises questions we are only just beginning to ask. The Carthaginians were never the people Rome told us they were. The DNA has confirmed it. They were diverse, integrated, cosmopolitan, a civilization whose genetic fingerprint tells a story of extraordinary openness, not ritualistic brutality. A people who built their power not through ethnic purity, but through absorption, synthesis, and connection across the full breadth of the ancient world. But the deeper revelation is this. If 2,000 years of accepted history about one of antiquity's greatest civilizations was fundamentally wrong, the question isn't just about Carthage anymore. It is about every silenced people whose story we think we know because their conquerors told it to us. The analysis of Carthaginian burial sites continues. More remains await sampling, more genomes remain unread. The picture is still forming. Carthage was erased once. Ancient DNA is making certain that never happens again.